Yay! My best Austin buddy, Emily Moyer, is back on the pod. How you doing, Emily?
Hot, but other than that, good. I just literally came in from exercise and ran up and like literally put my clothes on, still sweaty from my exercise, and here I am
Nice,
with you.
nice. That's what I like to see. Yeah, I had a very long, hot, sweaty day today too, but we have a much more mild climate, just being a few hundred miles north of you.
Yeah, it's pretty hot here right now. So we had a mild midsummer, early summer was kind of hot, and then it was mild through the middle, but it's been really hot this past week or so, and looks like it's going to continue. So you know,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
we're gonna get that high pressure system here too. It's gonna get hot.
All right, well, let's get hot, my friend. Let's do it.
Yes. So your last podcast, the one that you did with the laser, the molecule, and the magnet with Danny Goler, that got me hot and bothered, and it was awesome. It was so good, because essentially you had brought up a few things to me while I visited you and your lovely in Austin, and that really kind of I thought were extremely innovative ways to look at something like your perspective of the top of the well, would you like to tell the audience what you told me, because you can say it better?
So most of the people who probably are listening to you have heard me in the past talk about the skyscrape, the sort of the skyscape of Austin, right? The top, the
Mhm.
buildings and whatnot, as musical instruments, as genetic test kits, as all of these different kind of like things measuring particulates in the atmosphere. And I still think they perform the function of all of those things, plus a few
Mhm.
others. But a few weeks back, actually maybe a couple of months now, I was walking and just it dawned on me that all of the top floors of like the fanciest skyscrapers in towns looked kind of like mid-century modern homes or
Mhm.
power plants, or like if you go to the modern art museum or whatever it is, and that there's a few buildings around that look like what are known as field houses, which are a
Right.
structure where like athletics are done, that they're all pretty like they either look like fairly standard straight buildings. I mean, I've shown a few of the unusual buildings around town, like the Google
Mhm.
building and like the Independent that looks like Jenga. And I have a lot of things to say about those as well. But a lot of just the regular sort of fancy high rises that have like a little bit of a unique style to them, but in general are like fairly straight, like they look kind of like, just like a computer stack or a regular high rise. There are the reflective glass. They definitely have a lot of interesting things going on with the materials, but the top looks completely different than the rest of the building. It literally looks like there's something we understand as like a ground floor structure right at the
Mhm.
top of it. And I started to think about the fact that during a lockdown, a lot of new construction went up, and most of it is still sitting there empty, right? Like half of those
Mhm.
buildings downtown that I showed you are empty. Why?
Right.
Why would that be? Who would be spending all of this money to construct skyscrapers that then aren't going to be occupied? And I started to think that like maybe what we're looking at is this is the way they actually construct what we think of as deep underground military bases or DUMBs or underground
Mhm.
bases, is that they're literally yesterday's skyscrapers. So the top floor of the
Mm.
previous reset skyscrapers are the ground floor for the sort of, first people who will sort of seed a town or a location or whatnot. And they've got an underground base full of operating tech that everybody else doesn't really know about underneath them, that no one can see because it's literally buried under the ground. Think about that. That would be a much more efficient way to build an underground base than to have to hollow out the ground, right? If you
It's
live,
in uh, dude, that's why it fits. And then I don't when did you do the interview with Danny after I saw you?
yes.
Okay, so then you do this thing with Danny, and he's talking about plasma and all this stuff, and I had to like chime in because you're talking about magnets and all this stuff. And I sent you a DM and I was just like, okay, so you can get different flux lines depending on what type of material you are sending plasma through. High arc electricity is, for lack of a better term, plasma. And depending on the shape of the material, like, so what I was explaining was like if you have just a rectangle, like a bar magnet rectangle, and you send a high arc of electricity through one end and it goes out the other, that's what actually creates, let's say you use neodymium. That makes a neodymium, whatever strength magnet, depending on the amount of electricity you send. The really, really high powered magnets, the ones that they use in all these electric motors now, the ones that they use in supercomputers, and a lot of tech that we're not privy to, they use plasma arcs to actually, it's called sintering. And the crazy thing that they found is if you have like something that's a rectangle like this, right? And you send the arc through it, the flux lines that come out of the top are going to be the same as what goes into the bottom. But let's say you make it like a triangle or a cone, and you send that same arc through. Well, guess what? Because the piece of metal, whatever that is, let's just stick with neodymium, is coming to a point. Now you can get multiple Teslas of magnetic flux out of the tip. And one of my experiments, one of my inventions, I can't call it, it was never a completed invention because every time I tried to like look into the patent process, I kind of let it go. But I was seeing that most people that were conditioning water were using very just lame magnets, just essentially just using either a cylindrical magnet or they were using these bar magnets. And I was like, no, I'm going to vortex my water through an array that looks like a lampshade that has conical magnets. Because my teacher in magnetism, his name was Floyd Sweet from Kentucky, Dr. Floyd Sweet. He showed that off of a cone magnet, you got like incredible flux density to where you would have these anomalous effects. And that's like when you and Danny were talking, I was just like, and here's the thing that it links back to yesterday's skyscrapers is what they're showing when you create plasma in a water medium, which by the way, our environment, our air is water, you end up with extra material. Something about these high arcing plasmas creates extra material. So even if you don't have high arcing plasma, let's say you're just doing regular electrolysis, you can have plates of metal that have a charge and then the water creates the short between the two. Well, they'll find like some of these Kagan machines that have platinum plates. I think they have 4 platinum plates. After 30 years of running, they'll weigh the plates. The plates are exactly the same weight that they were coming out of the factory, but all the deposits that they've taken out of the machine for the last 30 years is equal to the weight of the plates. Now, where's that material coming from?
So, okay, interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna like some of this super sciencey stuff. Like I'm not as familiar with it as you are, but I think I understand what you're saying, and I think I have something interesting to say in regards to it. First of all those buildings in downtown Austin. If I were to take you to the roof of the apartment building we were living at before we moved over here, I could show you how at certain times, like the way that the buildings are constructed from far away, like the outlines of some of the buildings make it look like downtown is like Giza Plateau. Like there's a bunch of these pyramids, right? In some ways, it almost looks like a singular castle is being constructed, made up of separate buildings or separate parts or whatever, but it's like building a single triangle or a single pyramid. And it would be really, and also the city is surrounded by water, right? You have the river running through it, and then there's creeks on either side of downtown, and it almost creates like a moat around
Right.
downtown Austin, right? So I could see a scenario where something is being constructed that is almost like some sort of weird futuristic type of castle out of modern sort of architecture that, like, let's just say we experienced some sort of switch over or quote reset or some sort of shift in the system that kind of knocked lots of things out, brought the water up a little bit. Maybe there's some kind of like rising of the mud. So a lot of these buildings are not going to be skyscrapers anymore, but they're going to be this other kind of thing that I've just described here. I can see how a scenario is being set up where that cluster of stuff will have electricity via a process that you're describing here, when generally like the power plants and the electric plants and all that kind of stuff are not operating the way that they used to. That there could be some sort of system, right? Some sort of configuration being set up that, like, whatever is within that triangular pyramidal structure or whatever, it, you know, in this case, like parts of the city would be onto some sort of separate system. Everybody on the outskirts, this would look weird. It wouldn't look like what it used to look like. They wouldn't think what you and I are talking about here is going on there. And they're just worried about whatever's going on their side of the water. So I think about this sometimes. In addition, there's something strange going on with moisture here, right? Like where I work for my job, I work in a large refrigerator inside of a garage that is not climate controlled, right? So it's hot in the garage and then it's really cold in the refrigerator. And it's uncomfortable to go like in and out of it because like you're freezing and then you're sweating and then you get soaking wet and then you're back in the cold. So you get cold faster because you're wet. But I noticed all of a sudden this year, there's like all of this moisture pouring down the sides of the refrigerator, coming out of all the, like the where things meet on the bottom of the ground. There's like a lot of rust. Like it wasn't like that last year or the year before. And I was thinking like there's something wrong inside the coolant system, like where the condenser or something's creating a scenario where all this extra moisture and stuff is coming from. And so the woman who owns the kitchen, like it switched owners and the other guy was terrible, but she's pretty good. She got a couple people to come out and see if there's something wrong with the refrigerator. Right. And the first guy said, no, there's nothing wrong. It's normal. I'm like, I know it's not normal because it wasn't like this the last 2 years. And it's always hot and humid in Austin and whatever it is. And she got another guy to come out. And the other guy said, I don't know what's going on, but we are experiencing some sort of shift in our atmosphere in which there is way more pressure and moisture and humidity than there ever has been, because every fucking building that I have put that I service refrigerators on for this, whether I put them in or someone else did or not, they are all experiencing this for the first time this summer, and they never have before. Right. So there's something happening with, there is more moisture in the system, even for a place like this that's always been humid. It's more moisture and also more pressure, almost like the ceiling has been lowered or something like that. And the same amount of moisture is in the space, in the tighter space.
That makes a lot of sense. I've actually seen very, very low clouds this year overall. Like, you know, people say like the cloud line starts at 10,000 feet. There's no way. I'm seeing clouds like race over me in the morning with when I'm walking my dog. There's no way that they're up there at 10,000 feet. So with that higher moisture, imagine that there's a compression going on, right? That's very much like when they're doing high arcing plasma experiments. You essentially will have a space that is evacuated. I won't call it a vacuum, but they evacuate out as much as they can out of the little terrarium. Then they always have nodes, and these nodes are usually conductive. Well, what's more conductive than these lightning rod skyscrapers?
Yep. Very little. Very little. And
like, do you
in Austin, the two areas where there's the most amount of these buildings are also right near power plants that they try and pretend aren't nuclear, but I think they're nuclear, right? But you have two power plants right on either side of downtown, and then all of those skyscrapers there as well.
Yeah, because, you know, remember when drones first started to get popular and everybody was posting on YouTube all these videos of almost all the skyscrapers being empty, like in these major cities? And I knew this to be true because in South Florida, it's very easy. There, like in Fort Lauderdale, they pretty much all the skyscrapers that they put is on this one river, just like in Austin, the New River. And there are all these condominiums, right? And they're always building a new condominium that's bigger and badder than the last. But it's so crazy when you go down the New River and you look up at night, maybe a tenth of them have lights, maybe a tenth. And
Yeah.
even those that you see that have lights, you barely ever see anybody on a balcony. You don't see like anybody in these buildings. And my dad used to build skyscrapers back in the 80s and 90s for these huge banks, and they would have horrible occupancy numbers, like terrible occupancy numbers. And that's why it rang so true for me when you're like, oh man, these yesterday's skyscrapers thing, this whole thing with these are the future deep underground military bases. I thought that was like the most brilliant thing, because you're always talking about, there's multiple different realities that are occurring right now all at the same time. It just depends on what angle you're seeing it. And a lot of times you'll use your body as the mechanism to kind of, moving your body in a certain way changes like the actual electromagnetic field, your hormonal field, all these different things that allow the augmentation of what might be the collective purview. It's now different. Now you have a glimpse into what these buildings might really be for, or have a glimpse into like, all these other beings that are around you, what exactly they're running, like what energies they're running and all that. So I just know that there's a link. I know that there has to be something that is on this thread of these, because I've been on this thread of this whole notion of the little season. And in that thread, we have all these buildings, these antiquitech buildings that were way overbuilt, but they survived. But they survived whatever occurred. We don't know what occurred, but we can see like, oh, wow, those were not basements. Those were like the first and second stories that are now basements. Like we see that all over the world. And so there was obviously something that either raised the earth or caused the buildings to sink. I think that there's more material here. I think they kind of lie to us when they say, oh, this is an expanding universe. Maybe it's an expanding realm, but it's like the mass is expanding. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe like every reset, or whenever this thing goes through like a plasma apocalypse, or like whenever there's like a huge shift, the people that are in the know, like the people like you're saying that live at the top of these different buildings, like who lives at the top of these buildings in your neighborhood?
Right.
Yeah, tell.
Okay. Huh? Oh, so like there's definitely one. Elon Musk is living over there, right? Yeah. There's like, I mean, there's plenty. So a lot of these buildings are hotels. Some of them are apartment buildings, but then a lot of times they'll have a separate like 5 or 10 floors up top that are condos, that are penthouses, right? And they're almost like a separate layer of the building. Okay, a couple of things though, based on what you said here. So a few years ago, Michael and I went pretty hardcore down like the sort of zoning, right? Like we've all heard of zoning laws, and people often think about it as, okay, you're allowed to have this kind of business in this kind of town, but not here. And this building can only be so high because you don't want to block this, or you can't have sound over here. And all that is true too. Dusty plasma clouds creating more material. There you go. Someone here has read Robert Temple as well. I've been reading the Robert Temple book. It's very good, right? Okay. And that's helping me understand a lot of this stuff. But one of the most interesting cities to look at in regards to zoning is Indianapolis. And Michael and I went down this rabbit hole pretty tight. And how I ended up on this was someone pointed me in the direction of a gentleman who's known as like the father of zoning. And his name is Edward Murray Bassett, right? And it's kind of
great
rabbit hole to go down. But in some of these old cities, they would have these rules about how like the tall buildings would be constructed. And only the very middle portion of the building could go the highest, right? And then the four corners of the building on the outside could be like almost as high, but not quite as high as that. And then there had to be like a sinking down in the middle between the four corners and the center portion of the building. And if you think about that, that would create the exactly like perfect scenario for like what I'm talking about, for there to be like a foundation. And then there's a part of the building literally up top that would look like something different than it was. But also the people who in the reality we're in now live in the highest part of the building are quote unquote wealthy people. They're the ascended masters of our fucking current reality, right? And if you look at some of these skyscrapers, the way they have built some of the balconies, literally it looks like a ladder for like a giant to kind of climb. So some of these buildings actually have like the initiatory process built into them, right? So you have a person who's like trying to ascend, and if you and I'm not saying that I am on board or off board or whatever with any of this stuff, but if somebody in this reality like is able to sort of ascend to the next level, then they'll be there to set the foundation for the new reality that comes on the other side. If you think about, that's like literally what like elite and titans of industry and all this kind of stuff always fucking talk about in terms of like creating for their progeny the ability to control the next version of reality that comes, and all of this kind of shit. Also, what you were saying about these skyscrapers and being empty and whatnot, one of the things that I notice in a lot of these empty skyscrapers is that the lights in the buildings will be on in patterns, right? Like there's no in there, but like there'll be it's almost like Morse code or something for like which office have the lights on, which office have the lights off. And there seems to be some rhyme or reason to it. And I personally think that the buildings are being used to communicate the available possibilities for current machinations to those in the know, right? The people who understand architecture, to my good buddy Juan, if you're out there listening, the Pythagorean palace masters or whatever it is, right? Both in the like in some of these buildings that are reflective glass on the outside, you see these sort of reflective realities that look kind of like the one we're in now, but kind of something entirely different. So it's almost like you're able to peer through the side mirror. We've seen this in occult practices and whatever it is into some other space. So there's that. You have this interesting like coloration that happens of the buildings at certain times of day. And I think some of that has to do with what's in the atmosphere in terms of like particulates or in terms of like barometric pressure or whatever's going on. It's almost like you know, when you like take the pH of what's going on in your body or the pH of your water in your pool and you see what color it is and you know what needs to be done. It's almost like something is measuring the reality. It's measuring the makeup of the reality. And then there's also like choreography going on amongst the buildings in terms of like the decorative light show. We have all these buildings with like these neon lights that look all exciting, but how come they're all like the same color on the same night? Do like the building operators talk to each other and plan it? So there's that. And then within that, there's this thing that I'm talking about that is like patterned lights in the building, even though no one's in there. Why is like every third light on, or there's like a pattern that looks like some kind of thing? It's like an SOS code. And in my opinion, it's a communication to anybody who understands the code, right? Whoever understands the code that's being laid down is picking up the message. And I don't know what they're talking about, but it seems to me that there's rhyme or reason to it. So I think being like abreast of what can be done with architecture and cityscaping and all of this kind of stuff, and also understanding where everything is in your city, right? Like, let's just say there was something happened in the ground rose, right? And if I've paid attention to from wherever I am, what angle everything else is at, like paid attention to the coordinates or paid attention to like how the sun hits that or whatever, then I could go there at some future time, and people who weren't paying attention to that wouldn't understand, or people who were wiped out or whatever the thing is. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. But if our landscape changes and you paid attention to where the things you thought were skyscrapers were previously, you may have a good idea where to go to see how civilization is going to sort of rise again. Right.
There's so many different things, because Another thing that you were talking about, which I really appreciated in your last pod with Danny, was that you were talking a lot about what I talk about, that frequency is location.
Yep.
So if you're very adamant that what you experience in LA is different than what you experience in Austin, is different than what you experience in New York. And anybody that has any semblance of sensitivity will admit that. Like, you're a different being in different areas. Like, there's a few people I know that like are very rigid in themselves, and they're not aware that they're different, but that doesn't mean that they aren't different, if you know what I mean. So let's go through a few things. Frequency is location. You have these different cities. You experience different angles. You condition the body differently in different areas, and each city is giving you like a little piece of the mosaic, a little piece of the bigger picture. Now we have these lights. We know that these lights that are being used in these different cities that are carrying a different base frequency, these lights that are being flashed are probably pretty pertinent to that specific area.
Mm-hmm.
We know people like Dr. Oh, I don't know if he was a doctor, but Royal Rife with his frequency machines. Who knows what these buildings, like, we see the light, but we don't know what other frequencies are being emitted from these things.
Yep.
In all honesty, when you look at a huge metal and glass building, that is a massive, I mean, a massive collector of etheric energy. And it's a massive collector of, they call it static electricity. Like, guys, like, static electricity isn't static, it's dynamic. So you have these colors doing whatever they're doing, and maybe it is just artistic, maybe they are just effing around, but you're very high level pattern recognizer.
Right.
It's not a random thing. It's not just some jerk off that they're paying at night to like just flicker some lights. It's not like it's a dance party.
Right.
Like, there's something going on. And
Did you
then
want-
it's
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So what I'm saying is like, if, let's say, during the day, during the heat of the day, during the sun of the day, these big static field generators that we call skyscrapers are taking on a certain amount of electricity, right?
Yep.
And then at night, as dusk comes, they start to flicker their lights. You're like, oh, it's a marketing campaign. They want to lease more space or whatever. But let's say that they are broadcasting a signal. Guess what you can do with the amplitude of all that electricity that you collected during the day? Like, a lot of people don't know, at the base of the Empire State Building for something like 65 or 70 years, it said, this is the electrical, like, I forget exactly what the Masonic, the plate said, but it essentially said that this is the electrical hub of
Right.
New York City.
Yeah.
The Empire State Building.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So I do think that these buildings are doing a lot of, like, I think they're made of interesting materials. I think they're collecting a lot of energy, right? Like, I think there's, I've even talked to somebody who told me that there's semiconductors in the walls of a lot of these buildings, right? Like, and I was like, oh, that's fucking fascinating. But let's play a game here for a second, right? So if anybody ever watched the OA, right, there was a discussion in the OA about how buildings were the things that connect the dimensions, right? And I've even showed you some buildings here that like literally looked like three different buildings, like almost pressed together, like three dimensions, right, kind of thing. So let's just say that, I mean, but like that at different points, different times, maybe it has to do with alignment of the sun or the moon or something with the stars or whatever it is. some specific building in downtown becomes the interdimensional connector. I don't think it's like all the buildings all the time, right? Maybe it's just one building that's there and it's hiding amongst all the others and it becomes activated at certain times. But I lean more towards there's probably a few specific buildings hiding around downtown that look, that are just part of the landscape of all of this. But the people in the know what's going on, and they're able to use those buildings as some type of jump room, or some type of, for people who've been watching or have already watched that Apple TV series Dark Matter, some sort of superposition corridor or something like that, where they're able to use the building to sort of access different realities. Depends on how you think of it. If you're thinking dimensionally, or if you're thinking timeline, or if you're thinking, whatever it is, right? I do think that that's part of what's going on. I think we have materials that, when vibrated in specific ways, or when sort of a ray of light hits at a certain angle, something happens, and they become something more than just what they seem to be, though they are that too. And I think that's one of the signatures of the designers of our reality, is that everything has multiple uses, right? They don't waste space. They don't waste, like, there's all this extra material that gets created by all the things that they do, and they find something to do with that as well.
I completely concur. I mean, I build buildings, and I know that the shape matters. I know that the material matters. And I do see them as a dimensional. It's just like, a tuning fork. If you're trying to hit a frequency, that tuning fork can tune into that frequency range because of the shape, right? But what's wild is that shape doesn't necessarily mean spatial radiation. So, like, I've been tuned from people that are 1,000 miles away. How does that make sense? I've had people tune me with radionics devices that don't even emit this, what you would call a vibration.
Right.
So these buildings, let's just back up a second and get really basic. Buildings, no matter what, take a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Effort equals intention. All right. When you go up, no matter what, no matter if you're just like the most basic electrical engineer, every 10 feet or so, you have to deal with an extra 100 volts of potential. Yet, they're making all these buildings out of highly conductive materials, right? It's not like they're like, you would think if you're going up and you have this massive amount of surface area, like, I understand a lot of these metals are light, glass is light relative to, like, using just like crazy strong concrete and all the rest of it. But, like, you're essentially building a massive electrical collector. Okay, whether you believe in ether or not, or whatever. So you have a lot of intention, you have a lot of effort, and you have a lot of conductive material. Just those three things, you give that to any magician and they're going to make stuff happen.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, even, let's just say that you have like some kind of unimaginative dunce who just has a lot of money, but they're living in the penthouse, right? And all that energy is kind of rising, right? Let's say you have creative people working in some of the businesses down below and whatnot, and you've got a building that is collecting energy and sending it up, and then you're up there sort of in a different stratosphere than everybody else. And it's almost like whatever radiation that these people are building, whatever energy they're emitting through their work is going up there and almost giving you a magic you don't naturally have, right? Like, you're kind of like living, like, that's a thing. This is probably part of why rich people like to live in penthouses, right? I'm sure some of them understand the esoterics and the whatnot of it, and then others really are practicing magic and know what they're doing. Buildings also have an etheric body, 100%. Like, buildings have fields around them where, like, as you're approaching it, you start to feel sort of the energy of that building, right? You don't necessarily have to be inside. And then there's also one of the phenomenal things that you find in cities is sometimes you find abandoned buildings that got all kinds of weird stuff going on inside of them too, good, bad, or indifferent,
Yes.
whatever it is. And they're there sort of in the mix of all of this kind of stuff. And like a lot of times people are choosing to live in fancy high rises downtown to have access to like the strange portal in the abandoned building over here, right? Like there's all kinds of weird shit going on, but resonant materials, right? Resonant materials, and then the ability for a person, whether they're doing it intentionally or maybe they like naturally have something about their way of being or their genetic makeup that allows them to become sort of conductive, right? Like super conductive, like either conductive energetically, or like maybe they're even a person who's like really good at sort of clearing their mind and never thinking about the thing that just happened or the thing that's going to happen next. And they're just always like super in the present moment. It allows all sorts of things to happen when you're bringing your sort of energetic body into a field of resonant material. Like the sky's the limit on the number of I don't want to say weird, but the number of extraordinary things that can happen. And I think that, people who build buildings are putting massive effort into that, but also people who are laying out cities, like to put together a skyline for a city, right? Or to sort of design. I mean, there has to be people working in the background. I mean, I'm sure there's some government positions, but I'm thinking more of like people who've been with specific architecture firms from the day they started working until the day they die, or certain kinds of other, sure, we have our friends, the Freemasons, but there's even like architecture guilds and things like that of people who've like been there since the sort of metropolitan part of the city really started to develop. And they have had this idea that they have seen from when Austin was a pretty basic city. I remember when I first moved to Austin, there was like just a few big buildings and most of them were brown. It wasn't this really modern, high-tech, fantastic looking city that it is now. That has all happened in my lifetime. And it's entirely possible that the person that is about my age has been largely responsible for the cohesion, the way that the city has come together, or a small group of people who, for whatever reason, with whatever motivation, whatever. Like imagine if you and I were to have done that. Like, let's just say you and I had graduated from UT in the mid or late 90s, right? And we were sitting out in the park one day and we had a trip and we were just like, wouldn't it be cool if the city looked like this and like that? And And we knew all the architects and engineers in town because we graduated from architecture school, and we kind of decided that this is our long-term jam, right? We're going to turn downtown into something that looks like a fantastic people for the people who live there. But you and I know that we're building ourselves like this magical castle for ourselves to retreat into the future in, right? I'm sure that happened. And then it's intergenerational too. Like I'm sure there are families that you think about these like centuries old architecture firms and engineering firms that exist in specific cities. And this is a way to sort of leave your mark on reality, and to, on some level, even if it's just through genetic extension, sort of time travel into the future, right?
I'm totally tracking with you right now, because there is no city on the earth that when you dig down, you don't hit previous cities.
Correct.
Like, and literally the further they go down, the more advanced and bigger the cities were.
Yeah.
That's why what your theory struck me. And it also brings in this whole plasma apocalypse thing. Like back in the day, I think it was like 5 years ago, the guy that came up with the MCO stuff, he kind of captivated me for a minute, because I paid for like the $100 to like get his private videos or whatever. And he had some decent science, because I had been studying plasma. I had been studying how to make magnets and like what magnets would work best for what I do. And so it gets into plasma physics. And the one thing that you see in plasma physics, no matter what, is a lot of times what causes plasma? Electrostatics.
Yep.
So then it's like you start studying electrostatics, and they're like, why do they call it static? It's like the biggest like inversion ever. Like static is like the exact opposite. Like, like imagine you trying to stand still when your favorite DJ is doing their best set ever.
Right.
Could you imagine the amount of energy in you that was like trying to like come out while the DJ's doing their thing? That's the best analogy I can make to static electricity.
I think so I'm reading that book, A New Science of Heaven by Robert Temple, which for people who don't have a lot of experience, like delving into really the more scientific aspects of plasma, like we toss it around when we're talking about, metaphysical or esoteric topics, but to like really understand how it works, this guy does a really good job of taking you from like something very simple to, pretty high level stuff and it's really well written, right? So I think maybe one way of thinking about it is like the plasma is always there. It's got a bunch of intelligence embedded inside of it, and that intelligence, it's like this plasma field, and there's all of these separate structures in there that are their own sort of unique compartmentalized, like individual entities, and then almost like group structure entities of intelligences that don't have bodies, but are all around us, right? And I think that some of that is where the makeup of what we think of as like other dimensions or other multiverse or multiple reality theories are, right? That information to create that reality is all there. And it's kind of like what you can bring yourself into resonance with. Like part of what we were reading today was talking about, these Johnson junctions, or this Johnson effect, I think it is. And it's about what happens when you were talking about being tuned with something that's like thousands of miles away, right? So you have two things that are resonating, that are like acting as superconductors, like they're connecting, even though there's a barrier between them, and they're doing it through basically a type of quantum tunneling, right? Like a way, you'd think there's a barrier here. How are they? We understand how things do it when they're right near each other. Like your magnet here, your thing here and your thing here, and it starts resonating and whatnot. But how are things doing it either across distance or across a barrier? And I think that, that doesn't present the level of impediment that we thought. I was even thinking about this back when we were talking about that the ceiling is being lowered, like the pressure is increasing because, right? On some days when we have like the little white puffy clouds that look like sort of the clouds that I remember from when I was a kid, I do notice that like they're all flat on the bottom, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Looks like there's a ceiling, but then there's another set of the clouds up there that are higher up, but also flat. So it feels to me like there are some sort of like plasma or frequency walls or bands. And it's almost like we're in a dome, and then there's like another dome a few thousand feet outside of that. And it's like the Russian nesting dolls of like plasma arcs or frequency bands or something like that, right? And we think that like, okay, they're not penetrable. If somebody sends a rocket up, it's just going to hit it and fall back down. But you literally have to be resonating with the thing. There's like an attractor on this side that you come into resonance with, and then it's like you just move through it, right? You just kind of are able to move through. And I think some of this sort of plasma reality all around us is like different. Did you get a chance to watch the part 2 that I sent you?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so when he's describing, I played the video clip of him on Hunter and Chris's show, and he's talking about in the mountains behind where he lived, there was like a dish that was like dialing up the simulation, and then it showed him how like his reality rendered, right? Like I think that there's probably tech in some of these underground bases or companies, like where he is over there. That's like where JPL is, and it's about 25 miles from where I grew up, where Boeing and Rocketdyne is in the ground, right? If they have some sort of ability to use all of this information that's embedded in the atmosphere all around us, right? Like literally there's all of this dense code that he's able to see when he shines the laser on a surface when he's on DMT, but whether you can see it or not, it's all always there. And those coordinates or those bits of code can be somehow arranged into simulations for people to experience. So we're not living in a simulation, but we're living in some sort of computational system that produces simulations for people to experience. And what we think of as like the cities we live in are maybe even part of like the computer parts that create that are part of this computational system, and they're literally hashing out the algorithms and the codes from all of this intelligence around us. And what we think we're experiencing as like what's happening on this block or that block or whatever downtown is literally a product of that, right? I think that all kinds of intelligence is embedded in every little bit, space, inch, yard, mile, whatever around us. And just because it doesn't have like a body with a head and a brain or whatever it is, doesn't mean it's not sort of enacting on some level its own will on reality. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. And I can elaborate. And I think this will really tie a lot of things together. So no matter if you're a solar scientist using the largest, telescope to like look at the sun, or you're just the average everyday person that would just have, their own little solarium and measuring the arc. The arc from each one of us of the biggest plasma ball that we know, which is the sun, is always 13 miles. It never changes.
That makes sense.
Ever. Even if you're flying, the corpulescent rays will always change relative to you. And this is something that there were a few videos out when the flat earth stuff first started, like really taking hold in 2018 and 2019, that were all erased, that were essentially from these solar scientists that threw all their data into these big supercomputers, and they flipped out because when they crunched all the numbers of all the arcs from every continent, they essentially saw that there's only a 13-mile arc and it's personal. And when they mapped it, it looked like one of the Tibetan sun mandala. It's exactly what it looked like. And it, by the way, it was on a flat plane. And
Tibetan sun, I'm gonna look at the Tibetan sun mandala. Go ahead.
It's one of the Tibetan mandalas. I call it the sun mandala because that's the way I remember it.
Yep. Okay.
So these guys, they were all atheists, and they all became immediate believers in God at that point, because they're like, how is this possible? Like, we're told that we all share a sun, and that sun is 93.6 miles, 93.6 million miles away, yada, yada, yada. And yet all the data, like they had AI on these robots tracking this stuff. It wasn't like this could be up to human error. So we're talking plasma. Plasma is essentially the fourth phase of matter. It's when information from, let's call it the metaphysical, is being transduced. Transduced means it's changing into a different form. It's being transduced into the physical. We live as spiritual condensate. Like, we are spiritual condensate. And I love the fact that you call this a computational system, because frequency is location. That's the same thing as saying whatever your vibe is your tribe. This is your environment. This is an interactive computational system that's taking whatever is happening for you, those inputs, and then it's completely morphing. And you and I think, are of the same ilk, where I don't believe people are equal. I think certain people have a much greater capacity to change their environment because of, for whatever reason, maybe they have more energy or more of a connection to this.
Superconductive genetic, in my opinion, it has to do with something. I don't know the way to say it would be that it's in their genetics or in their blood. I don't know how to say it, but some people have a higher level of conductivity, right? They literally have trace elements, or what they're made up of has lower electrical resistance, which means that they can do a lot of work without overheating, and that more information can flood their system without it like going into overdrive, without it like flitzing out, right? I think that's what it is. I think that's the thing about some people, right? Is that they have a conductivity level that allows them to sort of burrow through a more highly charged information, electrically dense, like electric field without it overdoing them. Like, you know how some people like they get into like an area where there's like a lot going on and like, yeah, this is too much for me, I need to go home, right? That's sort of one way of looking at it, though it's not the most specific. I wanted to say something about your 13-mile arc, right? Like, I think one of the lies our parents tell us when we're kids, like on some levels it's true, but on another level it's not. They say like, what do you think, the world revolves around you? Right? You're not the center of the world.
It does.
But it
It
does.
totally does.
That's high game. That, like, but it's also true for everybody else, right? So we're each the center of our world, and we're in proximity to other people having that same experience, and there's some overlap. So I think probably that 13-mile arc that you're talking about like creates almost like some sort of bubble or dome, right? That is your field. And all of and then there's all these people that are within that 13-mile field, but like outside of that, like unless they, right, like it's not so overlapped. I mean, sure, we have connection with people far away, but I think one of the reasons that I've been able to, I was thinking about, it's funny you bring this up. I had no idea you were going to say anything about like a sun arc or 13 miles or whatever. I was trying to think today about what's different about being here in Austin for me, really. I mean, there's a million different things. But I've been able to figure more stuff out quickly here than in Los Angeles. And I think part of it is because it's a smaller city and I'm right in close to like where all of this stuff that we're talking about is. And I'm here every day. And it's small enough that I can keep track of all of the things going on around me. In Los Angeles, when I lived downtown, right, I was not in a good, like when I was living downtown, I was a drug addict and I didn't have confidence in myself. So whenever I had a thought, like I would second guess myself, or if I felt like there's something weird going on over there and I want to go investigate it, but maybe I shouldn't because I'm fucking high right now. And like, I don't want to run into some scenario I'm not prepared to handle or whatever. So I didn't have a chance to do downtown what I do sort of here. But when I'm living in Los Angeles, everything is so spread out that I can't sort of pay attention to small changes that happen every day. I can't keep track of what's going on with this building or that person who hangs out over there, or the way the sun is hitting this on the water at this time when I'm right. Everything is spread out and there's not a lot of like interaction between the things that I'm keeping track of. Right. And probably like I don't leave a 13-mile radius around here really very often. Like I go to work outside of it and then I come back, but for my whole rest of my life, it's like in here. So I'm sort of wandering around, checking on the status of all of the things that are interacting with my my typical sort of 13-mile arc or dome, right? And most people who are in this space are doing the sort of same. So I'm able to sort of monitor and measure and see how things shift and change over time and really notice a lot more about my environment than I ever was able to do living in Los Angeles because it's so big and spread out, right?
Yes.
Also just what is underneath the ground, like what literally the minerals and the dirt you're standing on is made of is completely helps to determine the way that you experience reality. Like that's part of that frequency is location. Go ahead.
So let me jump in on that. So one of the things with that Terrence Howard thing that he brought to people's attention, and everybody thought he was like the magical Negro saying something new. It's a very old concept. We've all seen the Vesica Pisces. It looks like a yoni. It's where you have two circles that overlap each other and they create at the radius, at the center, it creates this this, you know, the Pisces fish, you know, you've heard all different ways of saying it, right? Well, instead of thinking of just two circles, think of two spheres.
Right.
Well,
Yes.
now you have two spheres. And I mapped this back in the day when I was first learning SketchUp, because I build domes and I draw all my domes on SketchUp. And I was like, I had to do it was the seed of life and then the flower of life for a client of mine on his massive gate that he had going into his farm. And so I was playing with all these circles overlapping, making the seed of life. It's very easy to make, you know. And then I was like, hey, what happens if I make these spheres? And I did the spheres and I could see the negative space of it. Now imagine in the Vesica Pisces of two spheres, you look at it on the XYZ axis, zoom in, that sphere of you is going down into the ground. So the reason why frequency is location is you as a form have a field that goes down. It goes in every direction. It's universal, one might say. It's Catholic. It's Catholic. You know, the
Right.
cathode, the Catholic. It goes in every direction because it's grabbing the negative charge of the ground and it's grabbing the positive charge of the sky, and then it radiates it out in the circle. So each one of us, we have to deal with the Venn diagram. For those of you that are just listening, a Venn diagram is when you overlap two things. The area that they overlap in physics is known as a interference pattern. And it's very well known. If you look at Walter Russell's work, if you listen to Nikola Tesla, if you listen to John Worrell Keeley or Thomas Bearden, they will all tell you that matter is the interference pattern between two fields, two or more fields. Okay, so imagine each one of us has this 13-mile arc. That's just in one dimension. Now put it in two dimensions. Now put it in three dimensions. Okay, now that 13-mile sphere that you're in is picking up all the stuff in the ground. I know for a fact here, because I live over limestone, I can ground out so easy. The ground current here in a limestone rich area makes grounding so easy. When I lived in the tropics, living over paramagnetic soil where there's like literally no bedrock. It's just like, it's literally just this paramagnetic material going all the way down. I could barely find ground. Like, you can't find ground there. So you're so right. You're in your sphere of influence. We're told this all the time, right? Your sphere is local. And I really think things are much more local to us than we think. And then we go on these trips. We go in a plane, we go really high. And once I was with like a Raja Yogi flying to India, and he was looking out the window. I think we were flying over Tibet at the time, and he was like, he goes, you know, we're changing dimensions right now. And I thought he was just crazy. But he was probably right. You know, when you go up in elevation, you go away from your ground, you're actually flying in a metal tube that is picking up God knows how many kilowatts of electricity as it's flying through at the speeds that they're flying through. And so there is a change that being in that tube allows you to get to a different area and be somewhat relative to it, because it took you away from your baseline frequency that you were at.
Right.
When you were connected to the ground.
When you were up in the air, it sort of zeroed it out and allowed you to have sort of a new, like a fresh setting when you got
exactly.
Do you think though that I have a question. Like, I've thought forever that, like, when we go in airplanes, like I've even had the thought, like, are we just like going up and going down, coming down to like a different floor in the same building or a different layer of the cake? Like, are we not even really going anywhere, like traversing that much distance? And I don't know if that's just sort of metaphorical as I was thinking of it, or if I really think, I'm not sure, I'm of multiple minds. But I went to Chicago recently, and giant oil field under Los Angeles. Affirmative. I went to Chicago for the first time recently. Okay. And I liked it quite a bit. I just was floored by the layout of the city and by some of the architecture. And like, it was right. Like, and it was funny because I start texting my friend Jeff on there, all these things. And then while I was there, that series Dark Matter came out. That's all about like multiple dimensions in Chicago. And he's like, why are you telling me about your reality as a TV show about the reality you're describing is just coming out right now? And I'm watching the first episode, right? But like literally they're talking about in the show sort of what I'm talking about. Also, I have a series with Chris and Hunter from The Melt, and Laura's on, and my girlfriend Laura's on with us called Dark Matter. So that's fucking weird. But I noticed that there were some things about Chicago that were very similar to Austin. In fact, some of the buildings in Chicago looked exactly like the buildings here in Austin, but bigger. I'm excellent with directions, just so you know. I'm excellent with directions. Like when I was 6, my mom would get lost and I would figure out how to get us wherever we were going. So, okay. The buildings in Chicago looked quite a bit like the buildings here in Austin. In fact, there were a few that are identical, except for the lower part of the building, the part where not the interesting stuff was much bigger, right? So they're like 3 times as high, but like the top part of the building looks exactly the same as the one here. And I talked about it on a show, and someone sent me an article that there's like people who were very prolific in designing the skyline in Chicago are working on the skyline here. And what's interesting is a lot of these buildings that are taller but similar here as the ones here, like they're a little farther back from the water than the buildings are here. So they would have to be higher to achieve the same upside down reflection in the water on a clear day, which I think is like part of the point of these buildings. I think that there's cities that are similar enough in their layout that you can move between the cities. You don't even have to go on the airplane, right? Like, I think that it's entirely possible that people like that there's magicians out there who are figuring out a way to sort of portal between Austin and Chicago, because the way the relationship of the city, of the skyscrapers to the waterways, the river, and ultimately the lake there are similar enough that they can almost become the same, right? Like I really feel like some of these buildings are connective. There's also like, I don't want to go like deep down this rabbit hole right now, but I'm sure most people at this point have heard that there's a serial killer in Austin, people say, right? I mean, this has been going on since 40 or 50 years here, and it seems to all be connected. But what's weird is there also seems to be one in Chicago, and oftentimes weekends periods where there's nothing happening here, it's happening in Chicago. And there's been some pretty strange things about the people who go missing or turn up dead here, in that, like, it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like you can find them on camera with anybody, even though it seems like maybe they were killed, right? And I think there's something weird going on dimensionally. Like, I think there's some kind of literally interdimensional sort of someone or something is luring people to the water. But I also think that maybe this person has figured out how to move back and forth between Austin and Chicago using the water or some of these buildings as a portal, and playing with some of this tech that I think includes resonant materials, cloaking technology, like harmonic like doing some weird stuff like what we're talking about. But the more weird things that happen with this case, the more I'm like, there's somebody in Austin who's got access to the kind of tech that we're talking about right now. And a lot of things that are happening are evidence of that. And literally, it's better to let people think that there's a serial killer than to let people know that we've got some sort of like, tech magnate playing with interdimensional movements and whatnot, living in Austin, which is probably more closer to the truth, right? Like, I think people accidentally and on purpose, and sometimes being lured, are being pulled into some of these experiments and movements.
I totally think so because the strongest Kabbalists I know, they use the tri mirror.
Yep.
I don't know if any of you have seen that. I don't recommend it. Like I've literally gotten done. Like one of them was a client of mine, and I would only work on him on his outer deck of his house, and then he wanted to show me this suite that he made, and I felt like this black hole in the corner of the room, and it was this. He did the tri mirror thing, and then he the way he inset it in, he built the whole hutch that it was in out of a hardwood that was going extinct.
Yep.
And it was like everything about it was charged with like just this deep like I am going to impose my will. Like
That's
there there was no thy will. It was only his will type of thing.
this.
And
Uh, this is
and
this.
I
Go ahead.
and I know a couple of very wealthy people that they did an infinity pool. So the
Mhm.
way their condominium was set up was they did their one they had like these duplexes, but because they were all like swingers, they set it up so that their pools, like you could have your privacy in your duplex, but all their infinity pools, the water would go to a on one side and the other, they would go, it'd be like two mirrors. And then if you were on the in the pool looking back, the whole side of the building was sliding glass doors. So there's your third mirror.
Yep.
And you look like I remember doing that, and like it was like freaky to me. So there's that triplicate mirror thing where it creates like this endless, like there's no depth perception in it.
Mhm.
So it's almost like you and I have talked about float tanks and things like that. Like when you could be like in a visual float tank, like when you're in anything where you can't feel the depth
Right.
of your body, like these buildings, like you're up in one of these buildings and it's mirroring down into the water like that. Like there is something to this. This is something that I know for a fact magicians use to invoke whatever energetic pattern that they're trying to do.
So I mean, the way that this city reflect, I mean, I've seen other cities like this, but never quite like here. The way this city can reflect so perfectly upside down in the water, and there's like sometimes there's more definition in the reflection. Like I'm seeing something in the reflection that I can't see when I'm looking at it here, which makes me wonder if we are living in the reflection and that there is some other like that there's a more native, the original reality is down there or something. But even in the creeks, like I could take you down Shoal Creek,
Mm-hmm.
which at a lot of places looks to be only 3 or 4 feet deep, but buildings that are 40 or 50 feet high are reflected perfectly upside down. So it literally looks like it goes 50 feet stories down there, even though you can see theoretically the creek bed is 3 feet down. Like I think there's something to this, right? Like I think on some of these perfectly reflective days, the opportunity to move between dimensions is more available. And I think that's why a lot of these corporations, particularly like some of these huge corporations like Google, like Facebook, like some of these companies that are down there, they want to be in one of those buildings that has that ability to reflect like that, because that allows them, access to a bunch of other things, or it allows them to do a kind of magic that you couldn't do otherwise. Yep.
It hit me, Emily.
Yeah.
All these skyscrapers are inverted cathedrals. When you look at the way a cathedral works, they usually ran the water through and under those buildings. Now, these new buildings, they're looking at the reflection of themselves in a water body that's outside of them.
Yes.
It's an inverted cathedral.
One of the things I saw, so if you like, there's this one, I remember I took you to that butterfly bridge where there was those owls and there was
Yeah.
that butterfly bridge. And I was showing you that one building on a perfectly clear day, when it reflects perfectly underneath, I swear to God, like in the corner against this one wall of rock, it looks like there's like an old lodge, like in the hill country of Scotland, hiding in the wall there. Like it's fucking weird. Like I felt like I saw people sitting under there, like they were sitting around having a drink and a smoke and discussing the machinations of how they were going to time travel to 2023 in Austin or whatever the fuck it was, right? Like I do think that there's something to what you're talking about, and it relates to some of these, you know, brotherhoods and secret societies who, you know, have sex within some of these churches and within some of these industries and corporations and whatnot. And here's the whole thing with these kinds of magic, like what you were saying about the guy in your, you know, that you worked on, and you would only work on him on the balcony or whatever, or some people who walk into some of these buildings that have all this crazy reflection going on. Like, I think we get polarized into like people who do this, who practice this kind of magic or know this kind of stuff, these, you know, occult magic, esoteric stuff. Like some people want to do it, and then other people think that like the people who do it are bad. And I think the whole, you were just saying how he was like imposing his will. He wants everybody to kind of come into his black hole there. Like, I think that the needle we're trying to thread here, right, is sort of like maximizing our own potentials and abilities to do what we want to do, and not infringing on the will of others, not imposing on the will of others, right? Finding, like, you see these people who, like, they build this stuff and then they think it's funny to do it to somebody who's unsuspecting, or maybe like their personal mojo doesn't make the jump room work, so you lure someone else into it so you can follow. I mean, there's all this kind of crazy shit, but it's like the problem, and I've heard this said about our current situation, is that, you know, you have to have your sort of spiritual development has to be in, like, it has to be even to your technological development. And when you get to this place where people's technological abilities have far outpaced sort of their spiritual development or their character development or whatever it is, then you have all of these scenarios where people feel no qualms about imposing their will or their tech or their experiment or whatever, either on other people, either luring people into it or not caring that what they're doing is affecting the reality of everyone else around them, right? It isn't, you know, we always talk about this idea that we would like there to be sort of sovereign tech, right? Where we didn't have to sell our souls to Facebook or Apple or Google or whatever to like use the machine that works, but also the things that we develop for our personal technologies, for our personal magic. Like, how are we like maximizing our ability to sort of be how we want to be or do what we want to do while respecting that of everyone around us. And that includes the places that we travel to, right? Like these, like if somebody becomes, you know, it's like if somebody is able to figure out how to move, how to bend reality a little bit, how to move between the layers and the timelines and whatever it is, like, don't go taking your bullshit there. Right? Or don't go there thinking that you're going to save yourself from some problem you have here and then impose your assholeness on the new dimension you found yourself in, right? Like, these are all the questions that, you know, that the conversations we need to be having with each other and ourselves as we figure these things out and we, you know, play with them, right? But I don't think the solution is to not do them and just to like leave all the cool shit to the fucktards. But I think we have to be really honest with ourselves about like what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we want, and are we being honest with ourselves and each other, right?
Well, the magic I like to play with is, I call it technology. In the specific technology that I get that I have a proclivity towards is dealing with water. It's dealing with how to clean, how to structure water, how to get water to essentially unlock, let's just call it the incommensurate geometry within us at all times. And the incommensurate geometry, for those of you who are unaware of that term, the relationship of the collapsing field that we call hydrogen relative to the collapsing fields that we call oxygen is if you were to look at the Great Pyramids at 1/3 of one face and 2/3 of the other face, that's called an incommensurate geometry. It's an infinite fractal. And that's why water, getting back to the water plasma thing, because the sun is a water plasma ball. But the whole notion of having this incommensurate geometry unlocked within us through the medium, like we're all submarines right now. Like even in Austin, you think it's humid in Austin and it's very dry relative to what I'm used to. But like we always live in a fluid. We're always in the amniotic fluid of Gaia. We're always in whatever this matter is, the Madre Tierra. Part of her essence is actually the atmosphere that we're in. And that is always distributing information. And the plasma interactions, I think at certain times get so intense that there could be like a collective plasma interaction where then you get these crazy big deposits where when you, like we were talking about earlier, if you put a tremendous amount of plasma through water, you end up with extra material. You end up with what's called extra earth. It has all of the rare minerals. It has all of the rare metals. It has humus in it. Like, how is that possible? It literally is. It's like we've done enough plasma physics to know that like you can literally create a star in a jar. You can create the sun with very little electricity, and at the same time, you can create something quote unquote out of nothing. But there's no such thing as nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum. Like even in a space that we consider as nothing, there's actually infinite intelligence and information. So when a wave moves through it or an intention moves through it that acts like a wave or whatever, you get some sort of collapsing field that creates some sort of thing. And depending on where you are, wherever your sphere of influence is in this realm, that will beget what possibilities are actually available to you, right? So the energetics of this are very incredible to me. And the one thing that Danny was talking about, could you elucidate people with what Danny's talking about with seeing the code?
So, okay, so you guys can go to, like I have an interview from last year with him on my YouTube channel that's called We Live in a Computational System. And then the interview that I just posted this week is titled The Laser, the Molecule, and the Magnet. And Danny has discovered that if he shines a diffracted laser at any surface and smokes DMT, he sees a code running in reality. It's between the laser and the surface. And he has hundreds of people have tried this. Some of them used a laser he built for them. Some built their own laser. Some bought a laser that was already made. So it's not like something he's doing to the laser. And sometimes everybody eventually sees the code. For some people, it takes them a little bit longer, but then once they see it, then it's always there. And right. So he's working on a documentary right now. You guys can watch the trailer. It's in the description from the most recent show I did with him. Right. Mm-hmm. So he's spent the last couple of years getting people to try this. And now he's trying to, okay, we have like a thing. If we're trying to prove that it's an objective thing that is there and not some sort of just shared hallucination, the next thing we have to do is see if we can affect the thing. Right. So what he's trying to do now is get a magnet of a specific strength to see if they can get the code to change or move based on introducing electromagnetism or magnetism or whatever to the equation. But to me, for me, like I told him about the book, I'm like, I wonder. So in A New Science of Heaven, Robert Temple literally says that this plasma field that is all around us is like a giant brain that is capable of doing digital computation and storing data, right? So like literally like what the cloud, like we're told what the cloud is, but like there's like literally a physical one sort of around us that maybe this would be equal to what some people had referred to as like an Akashic field or whatever it is. But literally, it's an intelligent environment all around us that is doing computations and storing information about everything that's going on all the time, just like we do sort of with our brains, right? And maybe we're seeing the workings of that on the other side of the laser. It's at a slightly different frequency. So unless, you know, you're in a condition, it's kind of like you're putting yourself, you know, you're putting yourself in a specific condition, and then you're shining a light, and then you can see it, but it's always there for everybody all around the world, any place that they've done it, right? It's never different. It's the same. They haven't been able to look at it clearly enough or long enough to like try to decipher what the specific code is saying, but it's the same characters over and over and over again. Everyone is seeing the exact same code, not different codes. You suggested to Danny when he shines the laser through the water and he sees the code in the water to freeze the water. Yeah, that's a good idea, to capture the code. I mean, that would be fast if somehow there was some way of introducing a way to be able to record this, right? And that you could then look at it again when you're not in those conditions. That would be really weird. You know, that would be really cool. Like when we go on vacation, we can take a picture of something we saw and bring it home and show people. And that's how we know it, you know, they know we were there. But yeah, that would be interesting to see if the code could be frozen in the water and if it was the same code. That's a good idea.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea.
Yeah. And then the other thing is when he and I were talking, I was telling him about a lot of my experiences with dancing and literally decoding information from the field through dancing, or literally seeing what seems to be like other versions of myself or whatever it is. And he had never thought to see if he could affect the code with movement or with dancing. Now, if dancing creates a bigger radiance around me, or like, or a field with like a different set of radiation, if that caused there to be some sort of change, right? You can create electromagnetism through movement, right? Like this is, I mean, people move, like you see people doing some kind of motion over there and suddenly everybody's looking and people are descending on it. There's something that's acting as an attractor, right? Like magnetism. If that could affect the code, even if it just made it like move, right? Like even if it made it moved or made it do something else. So now he's like, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to see, like, let's see what happens if we get someone to do, that was part of how they move dimensions in OA, right? See if you can affect the code that way. I mean, if we're living in a system that is literally like dialing up realities for us to experience, if we can affect those, if we can document that, like, oh yeah, you do this, this, and that, and it changes it. I mean, now we're really talking, right?
Right. Well, the thing is like, think about it. Like your heart is an electromagnetic cavitation organ. Like what it does is it collapses the field. And as far as I could tell, the deepest meditations I ever got into, my heart stopped. Like my heart wouldn't beat for minutes on end. And that sounds crazy, but a lot of people have done it. You know, there's all different practices. You could do the Wim Hof thing. There's literally like there's so many different ways that this occurs. But what I noticed in my own being is when the agitation, because all the mind is an agitation. Every thought is an agitation. It's a vibration. As those agitations and vibrations, they start to drift into the forefront, and you actually just are the being, the heart will it doesn't need to really beat because what the heart does is it induces creation. Every time the collapse, the actual implosion happens, we have creation. But when you're actively meditating, like to be silent, like to like actually just like be the beingness, be the witness, there's no need for activity. So the heart stops. It just does. And then when activity occurs again, oh, okay, then the beating starts to occur again, and now that field collapses again into now the Venn diagrams of all these spheres and interference patterns come back, And it's just like, oh, okay, now I'm back in it. Now I'm back in the field. And we all get to experience this every night when we fall asleep. We all have the moment when we're falling asleep where we're like, fuck it, I'm out. And when you're out, when you leave, where do you leave to? Where's
Right.
that consciousness actually going? And like, what's actually happening to the body at that time? Like, I'll pick up my daughter during the day and wrestle with her when she's alive and awake and everything like that, and she weighs a certain weight. And then I'll pick her up when she's just out, and she weighs like 4 times as much. I'm like, where's like what happened? It's like the
Yeah.
levity of the actual energy of the field collapsing into her. It's just not there, right? So, oh yeah, James says concrescence of the heart. That's like one of my favorite words is concrescence. So there's something with this implosion organ that we have because we're told it's a pump. It couldn't be further from being a pump. It's not.
Well,
It collapses the field around us. We get to experience things. Home is where the heart is. Like, we're talking about our sphere of influence. Well, where does that sphere of influence start? Like, it radiates from the heart. Like, it's literally the field of your heart is what allows the matter, the material, the madre to actually form. Like, that's the form. Like, that's like the actual shape of things. Is this like, have you had similar experiences of this where you've kind of gotten to be like the fourth wall and behind the curtain, and you're just kind of witnessing everything in front of you to the point where like the information field, the vibrations, the agitations weren't even, they didn't even like hold your attention?
I think I understand what you're asking me. Like, yes, like there's been times where whatever I'm into, I'm so deeply into it, I forget that I'm even a person that's separate from whatever it is that I think I'm experiencing. And then, like at some point, I will remember that I'm a person and that I'm supposed to have thoughts about whatever's going on here, and like that I'm kind of back into the wave collapsed or whatever it is. Let me ask you something. Two things, real quick. I want to ask you about what you said about water a few minutes ago with like when you like put a wave through it, like it's creating material. And then I want to ask you
Mm-hmm.
something about the sort of Vesica Pisces Venn diagram kind of thing. So when you're talking about that, like it's creating material, all of the different rare earth metals and elements and whatnot, is this the like what Walter Russell says is that people think of elements as being substances. It's not. There's only one substance. Elements, like, sorry, not there's only one substance. There's not all these different substances. The elements themselves are the conditions that give rise to the substance. And
Yes.
so sort of have this prima matter, and then there's these energetic fields or these conditions that create that allow it to form into something that wasn't necessarily there before and might not even be there later, but for now that's there because the conditions gave rise to it. Is that what we're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. And just let me like, water is specific in this way, that water as being this relationship to hydrogen and oxygen, this fluid in and of itself it's like so magical in so many different ways. But because of that relationship of hydrogen to oxygen, it is the infinite antenna for the information field. So when you, depending on what spectrum of light you send through it, it will form, like it will literally, it will transduce that wave, that electromagnetic spectrum that's going through it into whatever that light frequency is telling it to transduce. That's why you'll find gold in all these panned out, streams that just shows up again. The people are like, how could that be? It's a mineral deposit. Like, no, the water is doing its little jumpy, wavy dance thingy that is equal to gold.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just more
Yeah.
gold shows up, right? And
Right.
so I've done years and years of experiments of doing orgone devices where I'll use different jackets of different mediums. And my favorite jacket is to use magnetite, and I'll put magnetite in like a glass vacuum cylinder, and then I'll put water in between it so that there's a little glass barrier between the magnetite, which is iron oxide, but it's iron oxide with the potential of every other precious metal that's out there.
Yes.
You let sunlight hit it, and you're growing, like within a month, you're growing all these different crystals of precious metals in it.
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
just wanted to be clear about that because water is special in that way. I don't know how many other fluids there are out there that do that.
Okay. I mean, the quote that I was talking about from Walter Russell, like it's something, there's a couple of different quotes around it that get to sort of what you're saying, right? That there's sort of one that they're like, basically whatever light does to substances light creates the condition, or light and frequency sort of creates the condition that substance will become a thing that we think of as an element, right? So like what you're talking about here with all the different minerals or whatever it was, they literally were not there before that, right? And the gold dance or whatever, like you said, and then it's there. It's like whatever sort of frequency or light spectrum was applied to the thing makes it be the thing. Right?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And that's why like it gets even crazier when you're using natural light.
Yep.
So like in India, they have this thing with each moon is a different deva. It's an actually different being. Like when you have a new moon, it's literally saying, "Hey, that's a new moon." Like what comes after, that's a totally different woman. And when you infuse like an essential oil, or you do a tincture or stuff like that at different times, you want to know which deva. Like Slick Dissident knows all about this with all he uses a different name for the devas, but each one has their own energetic field, and they'll impart. It's like using like a cherry barrel instead of a white oak barrel when you're aging your brandy. It's like
Yep.
it's a
Yep.
totally different thing.
Yep.
So yeah, so I just wanted to put that out there because our natural environment is so much more advanced than our synthetic overlay onto it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, it's almost as if our synthetic overlay is there to block or restrict its magnificence, right? To
Mm-hmm.
create boundaries or barriers around which it has to express itself rather than to come into fullness.
So this is my theory, and I've had this ever since learning about the plasma apocalypses and the mud floods and the resets and all this stuff, because I've actually seen it on the bench. I've taken the sludge out of Mojo cells. I've taken the sludge out of Weissman's hydrogen machine. And then you weigh the plates, and the plates weigh the same as they've always have. It's not electrolysis. It's not what, a lot of people say. It's just the degradation of the metal. So if we go to like this plasma thing, I think with all this synthetic overlay, I think they've tripped a cycle. Like they've tripped a cycle where their cycle is a synthetic overlay, where the natural system, you wouldn't need to have all these artifices
Right.
to actually have the interaction with the plasma beings in the sky. You wouldn't
Right.
have to have these artifices to actually go and have your own interaction with the lady in the lake.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
and I think there's a bunch of us that can still do that if we really chose to do that.
Yep.
But all these artifices to me almost feel like a condom. They almost feel like they're like limiting my actual capacity to interact with what's just, let's say at the edge of my sphere of influence.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that they create rules with which you have to do it, whereas before, like it's more open, right? In nature, it would have if they weren't creating these artifices, then it wouldn't be so conditional. But with the type of artifices they've created, everything has to line up in a specific, perfect way in order for that to become an option, right? And that is actually restrictive as opposed to what it would have otherwise been. But it also, when you say they trip the system, it does feel to me like um, some of these things that they have done to prepare for whatever they think is going to happen, which ultimately on some level they want to happen because they like the idea of being able to sort of roll right over it into the next system out ahead type of thing, but it's actually stopping the thing from happening that they want to have happen, and then they're confused as to why the thing that they prepared for didn't happen, right? And because all of these crazy sort of extents that they go to do this, and then nothing happens. It's almost like they're stopping the magic that they're preparing for by doing what
one thing I totally agree with you, because the one thing I really I've always vibed with you about is like you're pretty adamant that you have to move your body.
yeah.
And you get into that groove and you do your thing, and your body becomes its own portal. It becomes its own vessel. And I've known this forever with doing body work. Like I can drop into my heart and then be neutral in the space, and then that field is open to whatever needs to happen for healing. So I'm aware that our body is like the best orgone accumulator, the best portal, and everything like that. But what's interesting is with all these artifices, we don't really use our body.
Right. Well,
You know what I'm saying?
this was what I was going to ask you when you were talking about the sort of Vesica Pisces or the Venn diagram of these spheres or whatever it is, right? So there's definitely a specific geographical area in which I have the most amount of interesting experiences. Let's just call them, right? Like sort of extra, experiences. And it's also right. So I have way more of that stuff happen here in Austin than I have happen anywhere else. It's not that I don't have any of these experiences elsewhere, but they're of a different flavor and maybe they're less frequent. But all of the experiences in Austin happen in like a specific geographic area. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen when I'm moving, though often it does, right? Like when I'm dancing or when I'm exercising. But when I have them when I'm not dancing or exercising, it's still happening in an area where I have done a lot of dancing and exercising. So it's already like a really naturally rich area, both in terms of what's in the ground here, like the natural elements that are here, and then also the technology that's been created with intention around it. So there's lots of stuff going on here. But I have danced so much in this general area. I have exercised so much in this general area that there is so much of my energy sort of, right?
Investment.
Right? Like I have spent a lot of time like participating in the creation of the field here that it almost, I have more points of access because of that, right? Like I have, and I don't know if it's just that my energy is now part of that field, so it's easier for me to resonate with it, and I can draw out these extra bits of information or these access to these different sort of portals, or align the external portals with the internal. I don't know what it is, but I do notice that like the amount of radiation I have done in this few square miles where I tend to have the most amount of interesting experiences has to be part of that. Like I have built up my energy there. It's like I have a storage, like a capacitor, right? Like you were saying about the Empire State Building or whatever, right?
Yeah, it's known as punyas. And so you can have punyas with the earth spirits. Like I witness this all the time. A
How do you
punya
spell
is
it?
like, I forget, that is a Hindi word, but it's essentially like a spiritual credit.
I got it. I
Like when
found
you
it.
do, when you do good deeds and stuff like that, but they're also, you can have that like when you're investing your effort and your energy. Another way of thinking of it's like sweat equity.
Mm-hmm.
Like you know, in team settings, like, you know, you could have somebody that's ultra talented and people will have more respect for the person that has sweat equity. The
Mm-hmm.
land is like that. The land wants our fluids.
Yeah.
The land wants your sweat. The land wants your pee. The land wants it all. It all ends up being there anyway. You
There's like
know?
specific friction. Like when I spin and like I spin on my feet a lot when I dance, but when I used to break dance, I used to do a lot of like different kinds of elements that had specific spin. And I think there was like an energy or a radiance or some sort of field that is created when I spin that is like double charge, right? In addition to whatever sweat I pour when I'm exercising or the general sort of physics of my movement or anything like that. There's a certain sort of spin rate that like creates way more energy. It's far more over unity, right? Kind of thing than just regular movement. Yes, whirling dervish, exactly. Right. I did that, right? And I did it on my feet and I did it on my back and I did it on my knees, right? I made myself one with the ground here and created that spinning, right? I don't know.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah, yeah, but you cannot hold a candle to that Austrian breakdancer in the last Olympics. Bro, did you think of a more ridiculed, like I
Right.
laugh 10 times a day to all the memes that have been made about like, look, mom, I could go to the Olympics. Like it that poor woman with her lack of breakdancing skills. I mean, my goodness. Absolutely hilarious. When you saw that, I could only imagine you just laughing your
I was like, well, what's funny about it is I had like talked to this guy in the Uber, right? And he asked me what I thought about breakdancing in the Olympics. And I hadn't seen the thing that you told me yet. I'm like, I don't know, dude. I was like, it doesn't seem to me like the kind of breakers that I knew from the party scene and from the street and whatever. Like, it just doesn't feel like aligned, right? It just doesn't feel like they want to go to the Olympics, right?
yeah.
Kind of thing. And then literally the next day you showed me that, I'm like, no good breaker or popper is ever going to the Olympics again.
No, I mean that was such an insult. Such an insult. Like I actually thought of Slick, you know, with like his capoeira. And I could just imagine like a lame ass capoeista like going to the Olympics and like that dude would be like he would be so excommunicated from that community. I could only imagine like that
Does, does,
poor.
does Gabe do capoeira? Gabe, does he do capoeira?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't know.
He's like
I didn't
no,
know.
like dude, he's a archer, capoeirista, poet, like he's the man.
All right, I want to talk. All right, Gabe, we have to do a show and talk about capoeira. One of the biggest regrets of my life is that. So one of the early raves I ever went to, there was this guy dancing in the circle that was like moving in a way that I had never seen before, and I was like, "What the fuck is that guy doing?" And someone was like, "Oh yeah, that's guy's it's capoeira," and I was captivated. I watched him the whole night, right? And then like a few months later, I had moved to Austin. I was living here and I was like breakdancing in a circle at a party, and some dude came over to me and he was like, "Hey, I think you're a really good dancer." He's like, "I would love to teach you capoeira. Do you want to learn capoeira?" And for some reason, I got kind of like a creepy guy vibe from him. So I was just like, "Yeah, now I'm good." Right. And then for a lot of time after that, I wish that like I had just sort of explored that. And now I don't know that my body would do what it once did, but like I'm fascinated with capoeira. I love like I can still picture that guy in the 90s at this place in Los Angeles doing these moves in the middle of the circle, and he would get so much elevation on some of his like jumping, spinning moves or whatever. And remember, I'm a gymnast, so I've seen plenty of elevation, but there was something about the way this guy was moving. I've never seen anything like it before or since then. Let's talk capoeira sometime, Gabe.
Oh man, it's so beautiful. One of my first clients in Costa Rica, his son, he owned all these bars. He's the guy I told you that owned the Temple Bar and like the three other bars in downtown
Yep.
LA, like in the. in the early 2000s. His son, they lived on Venice Beach. In fact, where I went to go learn how to build the domes was in Hesperia, California,
I know
and
where it
they let me stay at their place in Venice. And his son would go down the boardwalk in Venice, and he was like the God. How old was Louis? Like Louis, I mean, he must have been like 8 or 9 years old, and he took to it like it was like second nature.
Yep.
Like
My
I was so. What's that?
my my dad took me down to Venice Beach during the 1984 Olympics, right? We went down
Mhm.
there because the marathon was going to pass through like the boardwalk in Venice, right? So we went down there to watch that because that's like the one Olympic event you didn't like need to have tickets for or whatever it was, right? So he took me down there and I gave zero shits about the marathon, but that was the first time I saw, like, the only other place I'd seen breakdancers before was in Flashdance, which I loved, and I taught myself all the
Right.
routines. But this was the first time I'd seen them in real life, like out there with their cardboard and the ghetto blasters. But like, because I did gymnastics, I was like, I can do that. So like, I'm there on the ground, like trying all the moves that I'm seeing the people doing, and I loved it, right? And from that point on, I was teaching myself breakdancing and in the living room and breaking all the
Mhm.
shit and whatever it is. But yeah, for sure.
So let's think about it. Let's tie all this together because
Let's try it together.
capoeira, the whole thing with like doing any, like when you're really embodied, you can move in every direction and pull it to the center.
Yep.
Like you have this capacity. And in Raja Yoga, they say whenever you move through space, you're absorbing the energy that you're moving through.
Yes.
We've already talked about angles or dimensions.
Yes.
So you're dancing, you're fucking spinning on XYZ axis when you're a breakdancer. When Gabe's doing his capoeira, he's spinning on an XYZ axis. He's spinning on all the axes. We already talked about our heart is an implosion organ. The field is collapsing. Imagine the field collapsing while you're your whirling dervish on the XYZ axis. Of course, you would have a different dimensional energy if you had any awareness whatsoever. Your sphere of influence now would be fully filled. You know what I'm saying? Because think of all the vectors when you're moving in all those different directions. Plus, what makes somebody really good at that type of movement is that it's almost like they're not dancing, they're being danced.
Right.
That's what I always told people is like, I don't dance, I'm being danced, because when it's really good, I cannot not move.
When you're able to like catch a groove, it's like for a surfer catching a wave, right? Like
Right.
it's like you just line it right up and it'll take you in, right? And sometimes when I like feel it, like I'll forget any restrictions I might have in my body. I might have been like in pain or not feeling well or whatever it is, and like suddenly like the groove hits me and I'm moving like I did when I was 20, and it feels amazing, and it's like it's just happening. It's like I can't.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something I'm making happening, and I can't stop it from happening, right? Like, and it feels like time stops, right? Like everything else is happening around me as opposed to like me move, right? Kind of thing. It's like I'm moving through everything that is almost like have you ever been to Small World at Disneyland, and you're like on the boat and you're moving through all these different realities? That's what it's like. It's like I'm just moving through all of these different realities and seeing it all around myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's totally that way. So I'm just thinking because you and I always talk about how we like to be around athletes.
Yeah.
And it's just because there's a certain, like when you're embodied, like when you have a certain level of embodiment and you can move on all the axes in a very capable way, you're informed differently because you're moving through form.
Yes.
Like you're literally moving through the form.
Yeah.
And so it transduces the energy differently through your being. And it also, I think you start to play with like, there's all these notions of what plasma is and like what the fluid is. I look at everything as fluid, like this is a fluid that we're in, whether it's plasma, ether, air, whatever you want to call it. It's a fluid. It acts like a fluid.
Yeah.
The verb of it is that it acts like a fluid. Like there's fluidity to it. It's
Yes.
not this like concretized thing, and it's always doing some form of pressure mediation. And you and I think what these massive buildings do, like just to kind of tie it all together, and like we're talking about the code and the ether and all this stuff, the informational field that we're in. When you take a massive investment, an investment, even if it's not being used, is still a high degree of intention.
Yep.
Like a lot of these buildings are just money laundering. Like especially in the South, like I mean, they'll build a building just to build it so the engine of the economy will keep going, you know?
Right.
But let's look at it from the esoteric side of it is like, okay, wherever you have mass, mass rules the day. There's a reason why the things before us that were more advanced, they overbuilt things. When you say overbuilt, that means they used mass. There was a lot of mass. And there's something about mass that is somewhat timeless, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you think about it, it's like, oh man, it's just there. It's gone through, you know, how many aeons or epochs of time. So therefore it's kind of timeless, right? And so you have these buildings. These buildings are a concentration of intention. They're taking the art, the artifice, and they're using it in whatever way that they are. Most of it, like I love the fact that you usually don't see high rises where they're not by water. And I mean, that's been my experience. This energy is being planted, and I just have this feeling that this level of artifice that we have, you have these like high level sorcerers. Maybe they're just keen to knowing the real history, so they have like a real calendar that we don't have. I don't know, but the they can use these buildings as these massive collectors of energy to kind of ride the wave of being timeless.
I think so. That yeah. I mean, look at if you look into art, like architecture books, and if you look in, like I have that Pythagorean palaces book and whatever it is,
Hmm.
like that's literally what they're talking about. They're talking about building this place that people that have refined their minds to a specific point can go to, and within the geometries of this building we have created, you can imagine all of these other buildings that might also live within it, right? And you can have
Hmm.
access to other realms through that. So they're literally building their sort of time travel device, their portal to another dimension, the surfboard that they will ride the wave on, or whatever it is. It's like this thing here is my access to all of the other things, or all of the other places I might ever want to go, or all of the other times I might want to be in. That this is something that will last and can be used in a variety of ways over
Hmm.
time, and that it's like, I mean, for some people who aren't very imaginative, it's a way of staying relevant. But for everybody else, for people who are imaginative, or who have sort of access their magic, it's a way of being engaged, right? Like it's a way of like being able to sort of map your relationship with the environment around you, right? Like, for me, like, I love this place, right? And I'm
Hmm.
examining every sort of little, I see all of these little weird nooks and crannies and locations in town here as like access points to dimensions that I can discover, or explore one day, right?
Hmm.
And have your own massive space. If you're like, I like this spot, like this is the spot for me, this is the one that grants me full access, and I'm going to build my arc here, then yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a problem with that. You know,
Right.
you
I'm
build your
there with
tunnel.
you. I mean, I really,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I build my dome. I love material reality. Like
Mhm.
I do. I'm also coming from spiritual principles where, oh, I got too many things going on here. I come from the spiritual principle that I don't, I'm spiritual condensate. Like I'm spirit first. I'm soul first. Matter is second. And I'll enjoy this place because obviously I need to learn and get better and all the rest of it. But it's not like I'm not all that attached to what happens here, if you know what I mean. And I find the people that can kind of the people that can kind of do what you and I do and what Gabe does and our cohort of folk is that to be able to ride that line of like the ride the boundary layer between the physical and the metaphysical.
Yes,
Most all of us don't have a high level of attachment.
I'd agree. Right? I'd agree. Like, so while I'm here, there's a way that I like it, but I also am like, and whatever the next adventure is what it is, and I'm good with that. Right? Like I like
Mhm.
that boundary, being able to sort of skate on that boundary, like makes you, you know, flexible for wherever you end,
Right.
kind of wherever you end up. Right?
Before we get out of here, I one of the concepts that you've been bringing up as of late with Danny and you and I talked about a little bit, and it's something that I've studied quite a bit, is this superconduction that you were alluding to earlier. And in superconduction, where there's like no resistance, so something can have an instantaneous movement. What we found is, or I shouldn't say what has been found is that water, the more structured water is, it acts as the best superconductor. And I'm an expert at myofascial release. Like that's like my main occupation is I do myofascial release on people. And there's this thin water jacket that's underneath the fascia. And they're coming to find out the whole nerve model that we've been told is utter garbage. Because the synapses and the dendrons and the dendrites and all this stuff that they say, like there's like it's like the same model that they give us with electrical lines where these electrons are traveling down the wire. That's not what's happening at all. Like electrons don't collect at the end of the line. As photons are quote unquote hitting my face, it's not like there's a collection of photons on me. That's all BS. So what you find is the water, the structured water, it becomes plasma. Even it becomes plasma on both the very large scale and on the very small scale. It gets so structured, it becomes a liquid crystal that has instantaneous energy
Mm,
transfer.
yeah.
And at the same time, it actually shows over and over and over again that it has non-linear, like a retrocausal information gathering
Yeah. Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
So like they'll slow down these like gymnasts, right, that are doing these like, flips on the uneven bars and stuff like that. Their body is reacting and making a choice, a subconscious choice. Like they'll show like the bars are moving and they're like a couple inches off where they should be. And while the gymnast is looking the other way, how is her body already contorting to know to pick up at the difference of where the pickup point's different. They have this with baseball hitters, like the guys that are hitting the ball they're changing their grip and everything before the ball is even released from the pitcher's hand. In
Yeah.
tennis, where they're serving at 140
I
miles
know.
per hour.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, so there's these things that the water, and it's not just water, there's spirit, there's other things, but just to stick with the physical model at the moment, you have water that's moving through the fascia that is actually connected to the water that's outside of your fascia.
Yes.
It's connected to the fluid that you're in. It's connected to the plasma field that you're in. And if you're not like trying to hold on to the reins of control, and you are like a little bit more fluid and confident in what you're doing, you get danced. You're not the
Yeah.
dancer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then like you go to the top of these buildings, and let's say that is a large supercapacitor, and now you are a superconductor standing on top of a supercapacitor.
Yeah.
I bet you could do some real you could get some things going if you
Right.
wanted.
Dance party in the penthouse at the right. Absolutely. No, what you're talking about, like the way that Robert Temple describes some of these complexes that are in plasma, right? That they will literally create their own little compartmentalized thing that has like their own rules or whatever set of physics or space or time in here. And it's separate from the plasma, which is all around them. But there may be another one over here that is similar to this one here. And there's connection and information passed between these two plasmas that are separated, right? But that are sort of doing the same dance. And they're able to communicate with each other, even though there's a plasma in between them that is operating on a different set of principles.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Emily, this crushed. I love you. Like,
I love you too.
you're. I can't wait to. I literally want to be the fly on the wall when you and Slick hit it, because I cannot wait.
All right, give Slick my phone number.
Because I have to say, your two minds are the minds that I appreciate the most in the sphere of my influence that I know. Because on a very consistent level, you both bring out perspectives that are wildly innovative and at the same time very connected to real physical experience.
Yeah,
And
they're grounded.
I so appreciate that. Like, I really, really appreciate where you're coming from. And anytime I get to talk with you, I'm stoked.
Me too. Yay. I love chatting with you as well. Give Slick my phone number. We'll do it up. You'll get to hear first. All that
Awesome.
jazz. Thanks for having me, buddy.
Awesome. All right, Emily, you have a great night. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.